on, when you have the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum on your platform, honey, you better just be thankful, because organizations like this, they are extremely, extremely busy. So I have to give this brother a proper introduction. I am now on Facebook Live. Thank you for all of you who are listening online. Thank you to those who are listening through the app. And hey, thank you for those who are watching on StreamYard. If you want to watch on StreamYard, you can listen. Whatever you choose to do, we just like to make you feel comfortable. But I have to give this brother, since it is his first time, no one is a stranger. I just love talking to people before the conversation, right? And brother has a good spirit, and he's just pounding the pavement for the Buffalo Soldiers. He is a historian, honey. You better not mess with Cale Carter II. That's all I'm going to say. But I have to give him a proper introduction. I don't bring people into the Dr. Don radio show any kind of way. We don't make you sit on the plastic couch like grandma used to. We make you feel comfortable. And tonight, for Knowledge is Power, our history and the military, got Cale Carter II. He is the director of exhibitions for the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum. How are you, Cale?
I'm doing pretty well. Yourself?
Good. Look, I am excited to have you all. I am excited. How was your day? Busy?
Very much so. Very busy.
Yeah. But you know what? We're going to talk about, we're just going to have a real talk. But Cale is, I don't think Cale, we really know a lot about our history and the military, right? We've seen the Tuskegee Airmen, we hear about them all the time, but it's a lot we don't know. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say. But tell us a little bit. We want to get to know you, those who, since this is your first time on the show, tell us a little bit about your role and how you got into this.
So my role at the museum, I'm the director of exhibitions, which means that I have to oversee the creation of exhibitions at the museum, maintain them, but then also when it comes to creating new ones, do the research, work closely with the archivists and other departments to try to gather the artifacts and try to gather a narrative to figure out how we want to present the history and basically create a way for it to be easily interpreted by the public. Because when it comes to Black military history and military history in general, it's a lot of jargon that once you, if you're within those circles, you know what the jargon is, but if you're outside of it, you're like, what the heck are those guys talking about? So
yeah.
That's kind of the bulk of my job. But then in addition to creating exhibitions, I also act as one of the researchers at the museum. So there are sometimes when we have downtime from working on exhibitions, people may come in and ask us questions about either their family or family members that was in the military, or someone may have a question about an artifact. So myself and the archivist, we assist in researching and clarifying information for people that come in and ask. So, but when it comes to kind of the involvement and what got me interested in Black military history, it was the fact that that growing up as a kid, I kind of grew up in that kind of tail end era, the Saving Private Ryan era, and watching History Channel. And oftentimes the main thing I would notice as a kid was that they would mention about these major battles, but they wouldn't mention any Black soldiers there. And if they did mention Black participation, if it was a Civil War, it would be the Massachusetts 54th Volunteers. If it was World War I, it was the Harlem Hellfighters. And if it was World War II, it was Tuskegee Airmen. And I would talk to people within the family as well as other people I knew, and they're like, well, my uncle was in World War II, or my great uncle was in World War I, but he wasn't a Tuskegee Airman, or he wasn't a part of the Harlem Hellfighters. So trying to do some more research to see what other units were out there, as well as try to highlight those lesser known units, is kind of what got me into this field and what has kept me in this field for years now.
Yeah. And this brings up another question. Because see, when we have a conversation, other questions come up. When you are a fact checker, right? Now we see Cale on social media, a lot of bad information being spread around, misinformation. Now, even, journalists are saying sources on TikTok, all of that. Just clear up a misconception or two, Cale, that you may have seen. But not only Black military history, maybe Black military history or Black history, period.
Well, let's say, I know as we go through, we're gonna probably end up clarifying some other ones, but one of the ones that stick out the most actually ties to this exhibition we just wrapped up, which was when it came to the employment of black soldiers, particularly the 93rd Infantry Division, the Pacific Theater. The thing that I was always told when I was first asking questions about them was that, oh, the unit didn't see combat and that
Mm-hmm.
they took minimal losses, so therefore essentially they were not really worthy of preserving their story. And this is not from
Mm.
like people who are outside the military history. This is within the military history realm, because within the military history sphere of knowledge, particularly when it comes to like the area I'm in, the focus is on units that have like lengthy combat records, took serious losses, because that's that seems to be as considered a mark to say, okay, well, they served and they did their purpose.
Okay.
Well, with the 93rd, they did see combat, one, and then two, the losses that they took were actually minimized. So
Okay.
if you look up the unit on Wikipedia, for example, they will
Mm-hmm.
say, oh, well, they only lost 11,
Mm-hmm.
and they only lost 11 total throughout their service in the war. Well, when you check the actual after action reports from the regiments within the unit, one regiment alone lost 24 guys before
Wow.
they left one theater of operations. So
Wow.
the numbers, when you try to verify the source, it said, oh, well, we got our source from this source right here. But when you check the after action report, it actually says more. So it
Right.
ends up kind of being conflict information. And the speculation I have as to why that came about is because accessing the actual records can be tedious. And let's be honest, some people don't want to just do the research to actually verify that information. So,
But my thing is, and we're gonna move on in a minute. But my thing is, it's just lazy. If you don't know, then you don't need to report on that. That's my, oh well, we'll just make up 11, and then we'll put out a on page 20. We'll just say, oh, it's a lack of integrity. What it comes down to. But that's why you have to do your own research. I don't care if it is Wikipedia, right? I don't care if it is. Do the History Channel, whatever. Do your own research. So I think that's important for us to know our history, right, Cale?
almost
Um,
definitely.
yeah, because in the position you're in, you have to make sure I'm sure you're looking at not only one source, but 3 or 4 to make sure it lines up.
Yeah, on
Yeah.
average, on
Yeah.
average, when you do research, if you're fortunate, because that's the other issue that comes up with researching black units, some black unit records have either been destroyed after the war
Mm,
or they're scarce or they're hard to get your hands on. So if you're fortunate enough, I know in my case, I would try to at least find a minimum of 3. But
okay.
with some of the more well-researched units, oh, it's easy to find at least at the minimum 10 sources to cross-reference, especially when you talk about first-person accounts, the records from the regiments or the units themselves, and again cross-referencing with the veteran statements as well as other research that's out there. So.
Mm. But also, Cale, how do when we are talking about, and see, that's why I love having these conversations, because it leads to something else. Back in those days, we know some records may have been falsified, right? How do you confirm? Because you have to do the best with what you can, but still and I just want people to know the credibility. That's what I'm saying. Because we know back in the day, maybe some records were falsified or what have you, right? Because they didn't want our people to look like they really contributed. So numbers were changed, so how do you determine with that? Do you keep that in mind when you're fact checking?
Yes, ma'am. So
Yeah.
I'll actually give you a primary example from research I've done, I would say about a few years back. So
Okay.
there's a black tank battalion in World War II called the 784th. The
Mm-hmm.
784th, I would make the argument, is so the more famous of the black tank battalions is the 761st Tank Battalion, but there was a total of 3. The 758th came first, the 761st came second, and then the 784th came third. So with the 784th, they arrived in Europe, I think, like right on January 1945, and that's when they basically have their baptism on fire. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the incidents that occurred early on is actually a friendly fire incident when Allied bombers were returning from a target. They couldn't find their target, so they just dropped bombs in an area they thought was open. They didn't
Mm.
know that there was a black what I think was Dog Company of the 784th was just their staging. They dropped bombs, and two of the soldiers that were basically working on the equipment were killed. Now,
Mm,
when you look at the after action reports, because again, after action reports, while they can be a credible source of information, you have to verify. You have to verify them, but then also keep in mind too, they're written by the officers of the unit, and when you're
right.
writing a report that reflects on your command, you want to make sure that things reflect semi accurately, or at least relatively positively on your command, because again, that report can lead to medals and so on and so forth, and
That's
can
right.
affect on your career. So
Yeah.
in the case of the after action report, the after action report said the first two casualties of the 784th occur in mid to late January 1945. However, there was a book written by this author named Joe Wilson. He wrote a book on the 784 Tank Battalion, and he had the testimonies of a few veterans who were in
Okay.
Dog Company that very day when the friendly fire incident occurred.
Okay.
And at pretty much all the veterans that was there said, yeah, it was two guys that were terribly wounded, and one of them actually remembered the names of the guys and their army service number. So
Okay. Okay.
so at least three of the veterans like, hey, these guys died this day. But according to the after action report, they said, oh, they were killed in action a few days later. So
See. Yeah. And that's what I'm getting at. You're going to have to, we have to dig deep. You cannot just take what someone they had to go back and say, hey, let's talk to. So I just wanted people to know that when the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum has some information, it's credible. That's all I'm trying to say. But that does make you think. You got to go back. You can't just take what was put on paper, because for all we know, there were some medals our people were supposed to get, right? And, let's be honest, because I want to go into this. Let's talk about black draftees, okay? How were they treated in training?
So it depends on which era you're talking about. When you talk about black draftees, you're talking about an era from as early as the Civil War and as late as Vietnam. So for just to keep time on this question, I'll focus on the World War II era. So in the World War II era, when you were conscripted into the military, the idea was that you would receive the same level of training, the same treatment as any other soldier, regardless of your race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
However, when you look at the narratives of black regiments, particularly those in the South, one of the main things you see is that when the soldiers are there, they have to deal with issues regarding officers, because again, when we look at the military at the time, especially in World War II, was by and large a very Southern institution. You're talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
officers from the South. You're talking about a lot of the major bases being in the South. And so, and not only that, but you also have things that the soldiers are facing when they're coming in. Like when you talk about World War II, a lot of the soldiers had to deal with the ramifications of the 1925 Army War College study that said that, well, black soldiers are capable at a certain level, but they have to be led by Southern white officers, because Southern white officers
Mm,
know how to handle, well, at least according to the Army, know how to best handle black soldiers. And that black
mm,
officers that at certain levels are not really competent. So you have that
mm.
aspect coming into play. And then when you talk about not only with while they're on base, but when they're off base. So when they're off base,
Yeah.
you have the fact that a lot of areas, particularly in the South, didn't really take too kindly to having black soldiers
Yeah.
down. And
Mm-hmm.
and in some cases, you see concerns from local town people, not only in World War II, but even as far back as World War One and even the Spanish American War, where you had towns like southern towns that say, well, we can't have this many armed black folks around us, especially if
Mm,
they're of a certain mindset, because on the one hand, the local black communities will say, well, we can look for them to protect us. And in many cases, the soldiers would, in many cases, go to bat for the local black community, because a lot of those soldiers, especially in the case of World War One, World War II, and even the Spanish American War, when they were staging, a lot of those guys had lineage back in the South, so they understood how Jim Crow impacted the communities there. At the same time, a lot of the local white populations were concerned about that, because the fear was that, well, you're talking about, let's say, say for example, a regiment, an infantry regiment is about what, anywhere between 2 to 3,000 soldiers, you subtract like the officer staff, the support units, you're still talking about anywhere between 1,500 so armed black soldiers. And if
Mm,
you talk about a southern small town that may only have like a 500 people, the
yeah.
concern is that, oh wow, these guys can overwhelm us, and not only that, but they're trained to actually use these weapons effectively.
Yeah.
So
That's interesting. I didn't even think of that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I tell you, but the key word you used was fear.
yeah,
You know, and I want to talk about that too because see, this is the thing, Cale, right? We have, despite the fact how our, African Americans were treated then, right? They still wanted to be on the front lines, and they still wanted to fight for this country, right? Now, some of it, correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Some of them, they wanted us, and they were like, okay, well, we're going to open it up. And I don't know if this is World War II. You correct me. We're because they needed as many soldiers, right? So you're free, no more slavery. You come and serve, right? So some soldiers, we know they did it because, hey, if I can be free, if I help fight for this country. But then others, I'm sure they were questioned about, why are you fighting for this country the way they've treated us, right? What have you found, in that regard?
so the period is like you're referring to as the Civil War. So in the
Okay.
Civil War, so and it's actually interesting. This is one of the things we're trying to incorporate at the museum too. So when you
Okay.
talk about black military service in this country as far back as the American Revolutionary War, most of the benefits prior to the Civil War boiled down to being able to simply be free. That hey,
Okay.
if you serve in the military, you can become free. Now, in the case
Mm.
of a handful of black folks up north, you gained freedom, you were able to own property, and in some cases, you may be able to vote here and there. But the Civil War, when you talk about the black community, is the game changer because not only does it mean, hey, that you will gain freedom on a wide scale, because when we talk about the Civil War, like even when you hear people talk about, oh, the Civil War is about states' rights. Well, when you talk about, well, one, states' rights to own slaves, but then two, when you talk about from the black perspective, black leadership like Frederick Douglass and
Mm-hmm.
Martin Delany, they kind of understood early on that, hey, this war is not only about ending slavery, but this is
Mm.
about guaranteeing those people the fruits of citizenship. So that becomes
Wow.
kind of a common theme that you see, particularly during the Civil War and even in wars after. So as a result, like during the Civil War, that's one of kind of the rallying cry. Like, hey, like we fight here, and then we basically fight for our citizenship after because we have earned it essentially in blood. And that's a thing that comes up even again
Wow.
in World War One as well, because during World War One, you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who was very vocal and very adamant about having black soldiers fight in World War One, and literally, I forgot the name of the the thing was either a speech or a poem that he wrote, but essentially saying that yeah, we're going to go and fight over in France, but we're also going to come back and fight here too. So,
Yeah.
and
That's good.
what's interesting is that both in the Civil War, World War One, and World War Two, one of the common themes you tend to see, especially when it comes to soldiers, is that basically you go fight in the war, but then you come back, and those veterans who come back, they end up advocating either for their local communities in the sense of being able to have the basic fruits of citizenship, the rights to own
Wow.
property or the right to vote. And so as a result, like it's almost kind of a common thing that after these major wars, particularly the Civil War, you can make the argument to a lesser degree the Spanish American War, but definitely World War One and World War Two, there's always a major civil rights movement that occurs immediately after the
Mm.
conflicts. So in the case of the Civil War, it's the Reconstruction period where you see
Yeah.
the early black leadership in the South. And after World War One, you see the Harlem Renaissance. And also, you see the backlash of the Red Summer, but you also see where black veterans are saying we're not going to take this type, we're going to lay down and take this type of beating from Jim Crow. And same thing with
That's right.
World War II in Korea. You see black veterans coming back, either joining the civil rights movement, and some kind of being the early advocates for black self-defense, like Robert Williams in them. So
That's good. That's good. So it kind of changes them in a sense that they're like, I'm fighting for this country, but now I'm gonna fight for my people in a way maybe I didn't before. Um,
exactly.
Yeah. Now we got to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, right? I think that's the most, everybody knows about that, right? Why are you laughing?
So so ironically, I think if people that will see this will know how I'll probably rate. Now, don't get me
Okay.
wrong. As
No, go
as
ahead.
a person who studies World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen helped me get into the field as from studying, and at the same time, one of the jokes I remember somebody was telling me that when it comes to me and Tuskegee Airmen, I kind of get a certain way because it's almost like when you go into a room and you talk about anything Black and World War II related, they essentially dominate everything to the point to
Yeah.
where the lesser known Black, like say for example, I'll give you a prime example. I did a presentation at my dad's college at Benedict College a few years back, and I did a presentation. Said, "Okay, show of hands, how many of y'all heard of the Tuskegee Airmen or the Red Tails?" Everyone raised
Yeah.
their hand. Okay, how about the 92nd? Few hands go down. How about the
Yeah.
364th Infantry? Everybody hands go down. So it's like base is a being one of the situations where it's kind of a blessing, but it's also a curse. It's a blessing because it's a Black unit that whose history is being told, is being acknowledged, but at the same time, depending on who you talk to, it's almost it tends to be considered at the detriment of other Black units or other stories as well. So
Yeah. Part of it is because it was made into a movie.
that too. So
And let's be honest, are we really researching? Are we really, do we know our history? And that's why this is knowledge is power. If it wasn't a movie, would we even know? Let's be honest,
well,
Cale.
I would actually add some other things. So I won't go into too much detail because this is something that we're going to be doing at the museum in terms of a virtual talk called
Mhm.
like understanding the like uncovering lesser known Black units, and
Good.
one of the things to kind of give a preview of it. Part of the reason why you know about the Tuskegee, like the Tuskegee Airmen, is one, even while the war was going on, there was a lot of coverage of that unit. And you have to
Yeah.
understand the context too. Like when you talk about certain units, there's certain things that have to be highlighted for certain units to be more focused on. Are
Mm.
these guys are in terms of like education, are they highly educated? Are they like regular Joe
Mm.
Schmoes? In
That's a good.
terms of their status, are they military officers? Are they pilots? Or are they like infantrymen? Are they engineers?
Yeah.
Or and then when you talk about their record and their clash with Jim Crow, when they dealt with Jim Crow, did they do so in an upstanding manner that's considered respectable, that may not be seen as so offensive to other people?
Yeah.
Or was it considered violent and up to a point to where like, yeah, we can talk about it, but it leads to controversy and stuff like that? So as like in many cases, like with the Tuskegee Airmen, like primary example, when they clashed with Jim Crow, they had the Freeman Field Mutiny, which, if you look at the way it was handled, was kind of handled similar to the lunch counter sit-ins of the 1960s. On the
Mm.
other hand, when you look at the experiences of black soldiers in other areas, like the 364th in Phoenix, Arizona, with the Phoenix Massacre, what was the reaction? They did us wrong. Okay, let's basically take rifles to them. Like
Yeah.
so, and so it's a lot of nuances to it that kind of play into that as well. It's not to say that Tuskegee Airmen don't deserve a claim, because they do deserve a
Yeah.
claim.
Yeah.
It just ends up being a fact that oftentimes there's a lot of nuances as to why certain units get more focus than others. And then, like you said too, so like popular culture plays a role. The
Yeah.
number of
Yeah.
veterans who are around that are able to live and tell the story, because the
Yeah.
Tuskegee Airmen, a lot of those guys, I think there's a few that's still around.
Mm.
Whereas when you talk about the other units, some of those guys died immediately when they came home. And
Wow.
then you had others who, again, because of not only because of army life, but because of what happened after with the stress of trying to find a job, trying
Oh
to provide
yeah.
for a family, it put them in early graves. So they
Mm.
weren't able to make it to become old enough to where the stories could be told to where the people in my generation who would love to hear those stories, like
Yeah.
by the time we came along, like see, like I was born in like '94, so by the time I came along, a lot of those guys might have been gone.
Mm. I want to read this comment. Thank you, Alfred Perry. Thank you to those who are listening online through the app and on watching on StreamYard and on the YouTube channel. I'm going to read Alfred's comment. He said, "Good evening, beautiful people. Thank you for sharing your positive and educational platform." Yes, he says education is knowledge and knowledge is power. Learning knowledge of self changed my life forever. He says, "Much brotherly love and respect." God bless you, Brother Perry. I tell you, knowledge is truly power.
Very much so.
And forgive me, and people, you all know I have to, yeah. Let me not say that because it was made into a movie. Our people are we like to research, but I'm just saying sometimes when it's made into a movie, it makes us more interested to do research, right? Things
Well,
we
not
didn't
just
know
us
that,
either. Like
yeah.
not just us either, because if you think about it, like I was having a conversation with one of my friends about even like we talk about white units in World War II. Most popular white units are Ranger battalions and airborne units. Why is that? Because Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan. So
Mm,
and
yeah.
so part of it is the popular culture aspect, but then again, too, like when it comes to military history, we tend to focus on those who have exploits that relate to combat. And
Uh,
ironically, when you talk about black units, a lot of black units that were deployed, particularly in World War I and World War II, they tend to be service units. And because of that, there's always tend to be a focus on combat units. But when we talk about the service units, we tend to kind of denigrate and say, well, they like it was seen as lesser than service than in comparison to
mm,
combat units. And to a degree, some people can make that argument because they say, okay, well, if you're in a service unit, you're not receiving the Distinguished Service Cross unless some random bomb just lands there. You manage to do a heroic action. But at the same time, when you look at, particularly in the case of World War II, the role that black service units played, what is interesting is that when you talk to military historians, they will tell you that yes, we focus on combat because again, combat, when you talk about war, is pretty eye-catching. But at the same time, the thing that you don't pay attention to, the logistics, the infrastructure, those were very critical in winning the war. And in fact, when you talk about the US involvement in World War II, one of the things that made us a powerhouse wasn't the number of troops we had on the battlefield, because in fact, I think the Soviet Union had way more troops and stuff. What made us stand out was the fact that we were able to get supplies to where they need to be at the same time. We were able to build infrastructure, some of the infrastructure which still remains to this day. And oftentimes, who was behind delivering that supplies? Who was
yeah,
behind
that's
building
right. That's
black
good.
troops? So
That's good. That's good. Yeah, we you know what, and that's what I was going to ask you next. Give us a contribution, an African American made in the military that we do not hear about. It's an unknown fact. It's a little known fact.
okay, so there's quite a few, but I'm gonna try to focus on two to
Okay.
keep time short. So one of the interesting things that is not really covered, but is an interesting tidbit, is the work that black engineers played in engineering the Alaskan Canadian Highway, or the Alcan Highway, during World
Okay.
War II. And the whole reason for the construction of the Alcan Highway in the first place was because when World War II first broke out, like we tend to look at it like, oh, we were going to win the war. But in early 1942, the concern was that we thought the Japanese were just going to come to the West Coast and invade through certain parts. So to help reinforce these desolate garrisons in Alaska, like not only with supplies but with fuel and oil and stuff like that, they had to build a highway that connected pretty much the northeastern part of the United States to Alaska through Canada. And
Mm,
among the units they used to help construct that highway were black engineer regiments, some of which came from Louisiana and other parts of the country. And so, like when we look at it now, that part didn't see that much combat because, of course,
mm,
like the Japanese didn't invade Canada, but at the same time, that infrastructure that a lot of those black soldiers helped build is still there to this very day.
yeah.
And then on the other side of the world, you have, so when we talk about World War II, it was truly a global war. Like even though when we see movies like, oh, it's either the invasion of France or the Pacific Theater,
Yeah.
there was warfare or things related to the war going on in Africa, the Middle East, China, Burma, India, you name it. And pretty much in most of those theaters, if there was a U.S. Army presence, there were most likely black soldiers there. And one of the more interesting things that's kind of not really covered as much, but right now I know we're trying to work on doing some more research
Yeah.
research on is the black presence in Liberia. So during World War II, Liberia was under the sphere of influence of the United States, and I want to say I think it was as early as 1942 we started deploying units there to basically one train the local forces there, but then two build the infrastructure there because it was part of the transportation route that they'll fly planes or bring in ships to basically drop off supplies and then move them up to northern Africa. And among the units that went there was a 37th Infantry Battalion, but then you also had a black medical unit that was sent there and a black unit that was sent there. And they end up building an airport, and they end up basically trying to restructure the port facilities. The
Wow.
airport is still there as far as the research I've done to this point. The airport is still there, and the port is still there, and pretty much like it's kind of funny that you basically said that, hey, black soldiers have basically built this infrastructure
Wow.
that still exists, and that's just one of many, basically.
Oh yeah, I absolutely believe it, and I tell you, Cale, it's up to us, and I want to thank Brother Perry. He put up another comment. He says, we have to have a true sense of self, right? We have to have true knowledge of ourselves, or we will self-destruct. He said, look at what's happening in our communities, right? Thank you, Brother Perry, for that comment. I tell you, we have to know our culture. We have to know, even me, myself, Cale, there are things that I'm learning. I know I could do more, right? I can't sit up here and act like I know all the facts. I know all the history. I got work to do too. Even something as simple, Cale, as us shaking down our family tree. Do we take time to say, hey, Auntie, tell me about great-great-great-grandma? Tell me about Uncle so-and-so. You see what I'm saying? Do we have those conversations anymore? So I think it's important we do destruct if we don't know, because if we didn't have the Buffalo Soldiers, you all are the only. Well, there is another museum.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. There is another, but I think only two, right? You, and then it's another museum.
So in terms of Buffalo Soldier museums, there's us, and then there's the museum in Washington State. Yeah. Then there's African American History Museum in I think it was in Mississippi, and there's an African American Civil War Museum that's up in DC. So as a few of us out there, is just one of those situations where we're spread out far and wide throughout the country, and when you look at it, they tend to be kind of small institutions as well. So, like, of
why
course,
is that? So why is it small? Is it because of the history, or because we're not contributing to build these?
Well, I would say when you look at it, a lot of the reason why they're kind of small right now is because most of the institutions that I know of, like the one in Mississippi, the one in DC, most of those were started by Black historians or people that was very interested in preserving the history and trying to basically get it done that way. In terms of support, the community, like at least as far as I recall, the community does support, or they try to help out any way they can. Now, and with that said, it goes into kind of another conversation, which I probably can't talk about that today. I'll probably talk about on another time when we get together and talk about more in more detail. But you can say basically part of it contributes to the generational wealth gap and stuff like that you play a role as well. But then also too, the fact that when it comes to, as I kind of alluded to before, when you talk about the Black military history and the knowledge of it, even amongst people who research this, and myself included, one, there's not that much information that's easily available. And then two, even when you do know what you're looking for, you run into obstacles, like into cases where either A, the records were destroyed after the war, or the cases to where there was some records, but people didn't know what happened to them. And even with artifacts, like there's like one of the saddest things I've witnessed, especially in my years as being at the museum and even as a volunteer, is when you have like Black families will say, hey, like I got my father's uniform from World War II, we managed to find it, but we wanted to go to the museum to preserve it because
Yeah.
like nobody in the family will really care for it. And now,
Mm,
and on the one hand, I kind of understand it because coming from like seeing the films I've seen, not everybody has a person that's really interested in like military history. Like, okay, well,
yeah.
let me take time to research. Now, to be fair, it's like there is a resurgence in the sense where people are like, oh, well, let me take hold into this and care for the next generation. But at
Yeah.
one time, like it's like okay, well, it's it to be honest, part of it is the trauma aspect of it, you could say, because when you
Yeah.
talk about that period, there's a lot of stuff that's still like when you talk about black military service, you're talking about stuff where like yeah, my uncle might have served honorably in War II, but he might have been denied certain rights when he came home, and or if he did have access to the right, he had to fight like many years after to gain them,
Yeah.
or like he had to like they had to deal with the scars, the psychological scars or the physical scars that came from it, and they didn't want to talk about it, and so when he passed away or if something happened, we don't know the history, so
Yeah,
and
that's a good point. He didn't want to talk about it. Like,
exactly,
Grandpa, tell me what happened. Oh, I don't want to talk about that.
yeah,
Yeah, so that's another. It was traumatic. So that
yeah,
that could be part of it too. But to know that your relative fought in this war and made history, and you don't, and no one in the family will care for it. You know, um, again, do we understand, and even me myself, right, do I understand who fought before me so I could be sitting in this chair, right? What am I going to do to pay it for the next generation? What history am I going to make? And then I hope when I die, it goes on. But what legacy are we leaving, Cale? Also, it makes us think, right? What legacy are we going to leave? What legacy are we going to leave? People fought and died. What legacy am I going to leave with media? What legacy are you going to leave, man? We got to have what are we going to do? For the next generation to follow. It makes you think because people fought for us to be here. What are we going to do? And prayerfully, it'll go on and on the next generation, right? But
yeah.
what are we going to do with our lives? What are we doing with our lives, man? Now, Cale, this is what I want to get into because you could tell I was about to go off on a little tangent, right?
Well, trust
Because
me, you're
that's
in
what
good
I'm.
company.
Hey, that's what I'm known for. What did you say?
I said, well, trust me, you're in good company because that's the reason why I had to ask about the time because like people that know me will know that like if you get me on a certain level, like yeah, like okay, like I would like we gotta cut that off and keep moving. So like yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah. But this ain't the tangent show. This is the no judgment, just realness. But yeah. But Cale, I tell you, I want to know what is your message to us because we're going to go into before we let you go. We got to talk about the upcoming exhibition, right? The Blue Helmets exhibition. But what is your message to us for Black History Month? Whether it's military related to African Americans and military, what is your message to us for Black History Month?
well, one I would say any type of history, any type of Black history, if it's in your family, preserve it as best you can, and just pass it to the next generation. Like even if you're just kind of telling the stories in passing, because I give you a prime example from my family, like part of the reason why my dad has some nominal knowledge of family history is because when he was a kid, they would kind of mention stories in the past. Like see, my dad, he wasn't like me. He wasn't like a hardcore historian. We're like, oh,
Yeah.
take out the kid. Like, no, he was just kind of, but he remembered the stories that they would tell him, or he remembered certain things he did with his great grandfather. And as a result, like he might not have appreciated it at that time when he was
Mm-hmm.
8, but as he got older, he came to appreciate it and had a better understanding of it. So I would say when it comes down to it, part of it is again trying to find a way to pass the information down. But then I would say too, like just doing like nominal research on your family if you can, or if you do have, or like even if you have like to people in the audience, if y'all have questions about like any military stuff in the family, like if try to ask the veteran if they're still around, if they're not, feel free to reach out to the museum. We'll do the best we can to help you. So
Mm. So hold on. If my great great grandfather served, I can say, Cale, can you help me find information on him?
if I if I have the information that can relate to them on hand, I will help. But if I don't, then I'll try to connect you to people that I know that can help. So
Okay.
the primary example, like I said, like my specialty primarily is World War II related stuff. With that being stated, while I may not be a full on Civil War guy or Spanish American War guy, and by that I mean that like when I do World War II research, if you say, okay, I need help about this, oh yeah, I know this unit, I know where they were at, but I'm not like that with Civil War units or Spanish American War. But because of, ironically, because of my life experiences, if I don't know about it, I know someone who
Okay.
can assist, and I
Okay.
can kind of pass you to them and say, okay, well maybe they can help you better than I can. So
Is it a cost for the museum? If is there a charge, or you all just ask for someone to sow a seed into the museum?
and you saw in terms of visiting the museum.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I want you to do some research, if I want the museum to help me do some research, is that a cost? Because somebody, I mean, this is good information. If somebody's like, hey, I'm trying to find this relative, I want to know more about them, is there a cost with that?
So as far as I know, no, because in most
Okay.
cases, what happens, people reach out. Now, the only thing about it, because of how busy we can be at times, we may not be able to reach out immediately. And
Yeah.
depending on what type of question you may ask, we may have information on hand, we may not. So,
Okay.
in fact, the primary example, there was a person that reached out and said, "Hey, my great great grandfather had this tombstone, and he had this information on it. Can you tell me what that is?" Like, oh yeah, that's the
Okay.
10th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. They out of Louisiana getting
Okay.
distributed. So like it's one of those situations where the more information you're able to bring up to find on your end, it makes it easier for us on our end to try to better direct you. Because like in some case, I know at the museum I was previously at in South Carolina, they say, okay, well, I just have a name and he was born this day. Okay, well,
Yeah, yeah,
we
yeah.
we had books at the museum that had enlistment records for World War One and World War Two that had basically black enlistees from World War One and World War Two. So because of that, like, oh, you have the name and the date of birth. Okay, I can find them and then send the information to them. But up to currently at the museum, we don't have anything like that because, and I think Texas really doesn't have, as far as I know to this point, they don't really have a comprehensive enlistment record of black soldiers in World War One and World War Two like South
Okay.
Carolina did, ironically enough. So,
Okay.
but the more information that you're able to find on your end, the better we can help
Okay.
on our end.
Okay. Okay. I gotta read Brother Perry's comment. He wants to share his testimony, and it's covering our faces. But Brother Perry, I don't even care. We gonna read your testimony, brother. He says, after going in and out of the system for 31 years, my goodness, and going to prison 5 times and serving 14 years and 9 months for a crime he did not commit.
Ooh.
He said being released, he's published 4 books, but he says educating himself about our Black history, it was one of the reasons that he successfully changed his slave mentality. I really think because, and he said it, he said educating himself. We cannot leave it up to the school system. We cannot leave it up, right, Cale?
Yeah.
We have to do our own research. It's nothing to ask great great grandma, hey grandma, tell me about your life. Because I find, Cale, don't you when you when we search our history, our personality came from somewhere, right? Our if because if I look back into my family's history, there was a businesswoman there who has the same personality, and you'll see like great 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 grandma look just like you, or you got your personality, or for all I know, I could be related to Harriet Tubman, and no wonder I'm I don't know, but I'm just saying our personality, yeah, from our parents, but they got their personality from so it's just interesting. Have you seen that show on PBS where they show celebrities, where they track the genealogy of celebrities?
Oh yes, man.
And
I've seen it a few
yeah,
times.
don't you love that? I love that show.
Oh yeah. The only I say I kind of wish, again, it's kind of mess up. Like
Say
this, you
it.
kind of see where my I am, but I kind of wish they would go to a random like regular black person, like, hey, let's help
Yeah.
you out. Because, and the reason, like, again, the reason I kind of feel like that, because with the celebrity, I'm like, okay, yeah, it's good that you got Skip Gates helping you out do the research, but I'm like, you may have the resources already. Like I could, like, prime example, in South Carolina, like most folks I knew, like one of my friends' families from Roebuck, South Carolina, like they working class black folks. They don't have, like, it's like if they look at it, they may have a connection and say, okay, well, let me help you out when I have free time. But I'm like, so like I say, I kind of wish that I kind of wish there was more shows where, like, okay, like, hey, we're live in Jennings, Louisiana, like with
Yeah.
so and so. Let's help them research their lineage and stuff like that. Because like with the celebrity, yeah, it's empowering to them. But like, can you imagine how empowering that would be for like basically a regular black person from
Yeah.
like
But
anywhere in the country?
But it
So
is TV. So
yeah,
if they're doing it for celebrities, that brings more people to watch the show. You see what
yeah,
I'm
and that's true
saying?
too.
So
So
it's all about television. When you got Oprah, Quincy Jones, all these people, famous black people, that's going to bring people to PBS to watch the show. Maybe they'll add that in. I haven't seen the show in a minute, but I tell you, I love the show, and they were surprised at where they came from.
oh yeah,
Okay, but yeah, that is your good point. Mix some everyday people up in there. Maybe that's a
exactly.
show the Buffalo Soldiers need to start. Y'all get on that. The Buffalo Soldiers show. Yeah, y'all are gonna get some. That's happening, right, Cale? When 2024? When is that gonna
Well,
happen? This year? Get on it. Start writing down. I would love to see that. That would be pretty good. Yeah.
I
I
know, I
just
know.
you see how we speak off the top of our heads. I just love it. Just yeah, or maybe I'll do it. Who knows? But that would be pretty cool. See, sometime when we have these ideas, let's do it ourselves. We can't wait on other people to do it. I think that is a very good idea. Think about that. If God leads you to do that, because sometimes when you're like, well, they need to do this, maybe you're the one called to do it. I'm just saying. I don't know. I put that out there to you, kid. I put you on the spot. You feel comfortable now. It's all in love. But I'm just saying. Maybe that's let God lead you in there. But we got to talk about before we let you go the Blue Helmets exhibition coming up. Right? When? Tell us all about it.
So the Blue Helmets exhibition it actually opened on February 1st,
Okay.
and as I mentioned before, I kind of like the thing. One of the things I like doing is covering lesser known black units, and the 93rd Infantry
Okay.
Division in World War II is one of the larger lesser known black units. It's an exhibition that kind of covers the 93rd and kind of goes with their history from kind of tracing back to World War I, but what they experienced, like what they experienced in World War II, what they experienced stateside, and the trials and tribulations they went through before deploying overseas, what they
Mm.
experienced deploying overseas, kind of the battles they had to fight with racism and stuff like that, but also their accomplishments while overseas, and then kind of talking a little bit about their legacy.
Okay. Okay. And it's all how long is the exhibition?
So the exhibition is a traveling exhibition. It opened on February 1st and it's going to close on June 30th. And then after that, we're going to bring in another exhibition. So,
What's that one going to be? Or you can't say it yet.
well, right now we're in the early stages, but most likely it's going to be on the Buffalo division in World War II.
Okay.
So the 92nd, unlike the 93rd, is a little bit more well known. However, from when I was doing my initial research on the 92nd and looking around at other institutions, because that's the other thing when you do exhibition, you have to see what other institutions are talking about and see what they are talking about, what they're not talking about. And
Okay.
one of the things I noticed with the 92nd that they're not really talking about, they talk more so about their time in Italy, but not what they experienced during their training stateside. And they kind of gloss over certain issues. So with the
Mm.
exhibition that we're planning right now, the idea is that we're going to try to plug those gaps and cover the unit in a way that actually sheds more light and brings more attention to lesser known aspects of it. Because unlike the 93rd, with the 93rd, very few, I think the only museum that might talk about the 93rd, I think, is the Fort Huachuca Military Museum.
Mm.
But by and large, most museums don't say, oh, well, the 93rd was here and that's it. So
Mm.
there's there's not really that much detail or really research really poured into it. So that's the idea we try to do when we do exhibitions at the museum. We try to do a lot of research, do in-depth research, cover some aspects that people say, oh wow, I didn't know they experienced that, or
Yeah.
talk about some stuff that the unit did both in combat but also stateside, and also the legacy of what happened to the soldiers in the unit after. Because
Mm.
when you talk about units, you just talk about a period, a few years at best, and then after that, like it's like okay, that's it. But in reality, when you talk about these units, you're talking about a legacy that stretches to this day, both in
Mm.
terms of how the soldiers were able to be treated, how were able to receive benefits, and in turn, if they didn't receive benefits, how that impacted their families, and even
Yes.
to this day. So being able to talk about stuff like that.
And they didn't get the same benefits, right?
So I'll
Did
try to
they get
keep.
the same benefits
So
as the white veterans?
So when you look at the benefits, particularly in World War I and World War II, the soldiers were entitled to the same benefits, meaning that as long as you served honorably, you were supposed to receive certain benefits. So in the case of World War
Mm-hmm.
One, if you served honorably, you was entitled to a pension. Now,
Okay.
this during World War One, the fact that soldiers received a pension actually kind of peeved, well, pissed off some southern states. Particularly, there was a case, I think it was some articles from South Carolina and Louisiana, where you had black veterans who basically had enough in pensions and savings to where they said, hey, they told their wives, hey, you don't have to work as the help for those people no more. Take the money, buy a plot of land, and basically we take care of our own land. The
Yeah.
problem was a lot of the people that they worked for got ticked off and
Yeah.
petitioned the local authorities to say, hey, make it to where those black women have to come back to work or else. So, and
Mm.
this is World War One. By the time World War Two comes along, they're starting to create what's now known as the GI Bill.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the idea behind it was that, in theory, as I mentioned before, as long as you had an honorable service, you were entitled to benefits, including low interest home loans, the bill to go to school and stuff like that. But they did give the states more power to control certain aspects of it. And so,
Mm.
as a result, in some of the southern states, you had cases where black veterans, well, before they even got the military, you had cases where black veterans would get locked out through stuff like the blue discharge, which was
Mm.
basically a general discharge to say, well, it wasn't honorable, but it wasn't dishonorable either. But if you
Mm.
got the general discharge, you may not be entitled to GI Bill benefits. And
Yeah.
oftentimes there's a given up to say, you were insubordinate towards an officer or something like that. Basically, meaning that
Wow.
probably one time an officer told you to do something stupid, you're like, sir, that doesn't make any sense. But
Yeah. Yeah.
even
Yeah.
but even if you got an honorable discharge, there were cases to where if you was a black veteran and you got an honorable discharge, you wasn't able to apply in certain ways. So there was a book, I forgot the name of it, but I want to say it was either when affirmative action was white or the color law. I forgot which one, but there was mentions of, and it might not have been, it might have been another book, but it was mentions about black veterans who knew how to drive trucks, who knew how to work on trucks. They wanted to get a low interest loan to purchase some military surplus trucks to start a trucking company. They couldn't do that. They wouldn't allow, like, the people wouldn't even allow them to buy trucks, even though they had an honorable discharge. They were entitled to it. Same thing with the low interest home loans. So with low interest home loans, in theory, if you're a veteran, you should be able to basically, use a low interest home loan to get a decent house.
Yeah.
Housing, of course, basically is one of the few ways that people can acquire wealth, because as the house gets older, it cures in value, and then you can basically sell it or basically keep it in the family or basically borrow against it. Well, with black veterans, some cases they weren't able to use it completely, so they couldn't even use that to buy a home. And if they could
Mm.
buy a home, due to redlining, they were restricted on where they could buy homes, which meant that if you did manage to buy a home, your home couldn't really accrue in any value, which meant that the
Wow.
wealth that you could have gained from that house, you couldn't gain. And then you talk about it from
Tell you.
1950s to 1970s, 1980s, when you look at like white veterans, for example, who were able to take advantage of that. They're like, by the time they pass on, or by the time they retire, well, they may start out as working poor, like, because in World War II you had a lot of white migrants, like Germans, Italians, stuff like that, who were able to do that, and they were able to gain wealth to where their kids were able to take off, borrow from the house, go to college,
Mm.
get a good paying job, and in turn do that. Whereas with the black families that were locked out, they weren't able to do that. Or and in
Yeah.
turn, so it ends up kind of being a giant snowball effect that kind of carried over even to this day.
Oh
So
yeah, I was doing research. There's supposedly, even our black veterans, today, and I'm wondering like how many families are you owed, did you, man, I tell you, Cale, we could go into another rant. We could have just a rant review. But for more brothers and sisters about the Buffalo Soldiers Museum, visit www.buffalosoldiersmuseum.org. Again, that is buffalosoldiersmuseum.org. Check them out, look them up. Tell them the Dr. Dunn sent you. Ask for my boy Cale. Can I say that, Cale?
Yes, ma'am, we
Yeah,
can.
yeah. I tell you, but Cale, brother, if I don't see you on Jeopardy sometime soon, I don't know. I need to see you on this. I mean, smart people. Good conversation. So, brother, I just want to say thank you and keep doing what you do.
And thank you for having me on, man.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Don't be a stranger.
I'll try not to be.
Yeah. And see, he's got the map in the background. Brother smart. Yeah. God bless you, Cale. Don't be a stranger, brother. Good night.
All right, good night, man.